vamos a tocar esta.
Bueno.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, friends, and peace be with each and every one of you. Some time ago, Dean asked me if I would share some reflections on the Mayan indigenous culture in Guatemala, and I was happy to accept his invitation. I'm an old man now, but some 45 years ago, when I was a young bloke fresh out of college, I served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Central America, in Guatemala, working in reforestation and soil conservation. I worked in a small, predominantly indigenous community called Rabinal, which is situated in a department or province called Baja Verapaz. Verapaz, the name the Spanish conquistadores gave to this part of the country, meaning true peace. For 3 years, I had the privilege of working alongside the proud, beautiful people of Rabinal, learning from them every day, eating and drinking with them, celebrating with them, and in the end, mourning with them for the losses they had suffered. My tour of service in Guatemala began with overbrimming energy and enthusiasm. And indeed, I felt at times like I could never again in my entire life feel as fully alive as I did almost every day during my time in the Rabinal. But some unspeakably awful things happened during my time there, the memory of which I have lived with for the last half century. They say that while a Peace Corps volunteer spends only 2 or 3 years in a community in the developing world, the experience there becomes a lens through which one views the world for the rest of one's life. One lives with the memory of it all. Thank God for memory, even when it hurts to remember. Memory is a treasure that can lead us to self-discovery, but memory can also be a weapon of self-defense, even a tool, perhaps, in the struggle to procure justice. When one sees one's own memory as a storehouse of past experiences that can be transformed into vital testimony, then memory may become a formidable weapon indeed. The great novelist Milan Kundera wrote that the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. These contrasting aspects of memory are what motivated me to work with my own memory, to try to pull together a number of vividly recalled experiences in the form of a memoir, which I call Walking with Evaristo, a memoir of celebration and tragedy in the land of the Achi Maya. Everything that I record in this volume falls, I believe, under 3 broad categories: light, enigma, confession. First of all, I want to celebrate the life of a community that I came to love, and I want to try to illuminate its colors, textures, sounds, and idiosyncrasies. I also want to shed some light on the dark forces that would eventually try to destroy this beautiful community. But a full treatment of the charm and allure of Rabinal must also come to terms with those many enigmas, those haunting, ever-confounding enigmas that are also part of the fabric of life there. And finally, I could not fail to include in this record my own confessions as a man, as an actor, and as a witness. Well, let's start with just a few basic facts about the village of Rabinal that I knew so many years ago. The central pueblo of Rabinal, where I lived, was surrounded by over 24 tiny aldeas or hamlets, all part of the greater municipio. Many of these aldeas, where most of my work was, could only be reached on foot. The population of Rabinal was around 80% indigenous Mayan, all of whom spoke a Mayan dialect known as Achi, one of about 23 Mayan dialects spoken in the whole territory of Guatemala. Most, but not all, but by no means all of the Mayans I met spoke at least passable Spanish. 2 cops in town, a 2-man post and telegraph office, and a small health clinic with 1 doctor, and a military garrison on the edge of town where 30 to 40 soldiers were stationed. Running water for about 8 or 9 hours every day, electricity in the central pueblo, yes, but lacking in most of the aldeas. 1 telephone in the whole town, located at the post office. Only heard about it, never saw it. And finally, personal computers not invented yet, nor the internet, nor cell phones. The street where I lived. The Central Plaza. A young Mayan woman serving a traditional hot beverage known as chilate. The women in the Central Plaza on market day. There was plenty of work to do in the Rabinal, and every week I'd walk out to its many tiny aldeas scattered over a picturesque mountainous countryside. I taught soil conservation techniques to the small farmers, most of whom owned scarcely a couple acres of land situated on rugged terrain, showing the farmers how to stake out contours using a simple A-frame level, and then making terraces following the contours of the land. And of course, planting trees. By the end of my second year in the Rabinal, we were producing up to 150,000 seedlings a year for outplanting on the hillsides and byways of the entire municipio. Pines, cedar, eucalyptus, even mahogany and fruit trees. But the signs of popular unrest in the country soon became impossible to ignore. And that unrest would be answered within a year of my arrival on the scene by a brutal government campaign of terror. It was Guatemala's Independence Day, the 15th of September, 1979, when I received on my doorstep my very first guerrilla flyer. Densely formatted on a single mimeograph sheet, it said, "To all the workers laboring in the fields of the Vera Pazes, the Committee for Peasant Unity extends a cordial greeting on this Independence Day, filled once again with parades and grand propaganda. The filthy rich and their government celebrates the independence of those murderous Spanish conquistadores who appropriated the very best land and lived off of the toil of our ancestors." And it goes on in the same vein for several more paragraphs. Clearly, people were getting killed out in the campo, though in my first year, I still had yet to witness the violence firsthand. At this juncture, the murder of innocent campesinos was not yet a daily occurrence, and not yet everywhere in the country. Still, I asked myself, where did all this trouble come from? When did it all begin, really? A reading from my memoir. One might say all the trouble began sometime before I arrived in the Rabinal. How long before is a matter of historical interpretation and perspective. Shall we say 9 months before in Pansos? Let's start there. Quote, "In the central plaza of Pansos, Alta Verapaz, some 10 kilometers northeast of Rabinal, members of the Zacapa military zone attacked a peaceful peasant demonstration, killing many people. The deceased peasants, indigenous people who had been summoned to the place, were fighting for the legalization of the public lands they had occupied for years. Their fight directly confronted them with investors who wanted to exploit the mineral wealth of the area, particularly the oil reserves, under contracts with Basic Resources International and Shenandoah Oil, and also nickel." End quote. But wait, no, that doesn't seem quite right. The Pansos massacre was a consequential event, no doubt about it, but the trouble started much earlier than that. Maybe it started some 12 years earlier. Quote, in March of 1966, the G2 and the judicial police raided 3 houses in Guatemala City, capturing 28 trade unionists and members of the PGT. Those captured included most of the PGT's Central Committee and Peasant Federation leader Leonardo Castillo Flores. All subsequently were disappeared while in the custody of the security force and became known in subsequent months by the Guatemalan press simply as the 28. This incident was followed by a wave of unexplained disappearances and killings in Guatemala City and in the countryside, which were reported by the Guatemala City press, end quote. Or maybe we really need to go back another 30 years earlier. Yes, back to the 1930s, back to the totalitarian regime of Jorge Ubico, when words like trade union, strike, and petition were literally banned from public discourse, and hundreds of thousands of poor Guatemalans found themselves working under conditions of virtual slavery. Then again, no. Actually, we need to go back another 60 years, even before Ubico, when an earlier president, Justo Rufino Barrios, known as the Reformer, transferred Guatemala's publicly owned wealth to the rich and influential private coffee growers. Under Barrios, peasants using village land were given 6 months to pay for their plot or forfeit it. Tens of thousands lost their land through this government scheme, and a majority soon found themselves ensnared in debt bondage. Was that the point when the intolerable oppression of the Mayan majority in Guatemala began? Realistically, in our search for the roots of revolution, we might as well go all the way back to the beginning of the Spanish occupation of the ancestral lands of the Mayan people in the 16th century, when the invading conquistadores made slaves of the Mayans in their own homeland. Don Pedro de Alvarado, that faithful lieutenant of Hernán Cortés and the first Spanish governor of Guatemala, was absolutely ruthless in his dealings with the indigenous peoples that he set out to conquer. Historians judge that his greed drove him to excessive cruelty, and his Spanish contemporaries denounced his extreme brutality even during his lifetime. Thus, facing the historic reality of more than 4 centuries of violent oppression of the Mayans in their own land, the leaders of Guatemala's Committee for Peasant Unity, founded in 1978, certainly had their work cut out for them. The CUC was described by its founder, Pablo Seto, as a convergence of the leftist insurgency and the Indigenous Peoples movement. It has been described as Guatemala's first national labor organization that was led by indigenous people. Around this time, in late 1979, I was only just beginning to appreciate the complexities of the political landscape in Guatemala. And despite the flyer on my doorstep and the presence of an army garrison on the edge of town, the rumor of civil war still seemed a distant concern that scarcely affected my day-to-day activities. But the pace of change would quicken in the days to come. During my time there were essentially 4 different guerrilla groups struggling to liberate the Guatemalan peasantry from their yoke of bondage. Shortly after my tour of service ended in 1982, these 4 groups merged into a single resistance. And in the other corner, the government of Guatemala, led during those years by General Fernando Romeo Lucas Garcia. Lucas's own brother, Manuel Benedicto, was the Army Chief of Staff, commanding a force of some 15,000 conscripts, including an elite special ops force known as the Caibiles, a highly trained cadre of tough young men who would be assigned to undertake some of the most brutally effective counterinsurgency campaigns, along with a supporting cast that probably should not surprise you. Need I say more? For decades, U.S. Marines and even the U.S. Border Patrol played a key role in training Guatemala's killers. These efforts became even more sophisticated in the aftermath of the 1954 coup d'etat orchestrated by the CIA, the coup which sabotaged Guatemalan democracy. The 1954 coup in Guatemala ushered in a new era of violent suppression of the voices of justice and equality that would last another quarter century, up through the time of my arrival on the scene in 1978. Here we see Diego Rivera's defiantly satirical mural memorializing the events of 1954. The artist Frida Kahlo joined in a peaceful protest against the U.S. intervention in Guatemala. It would be her last appearance in public, as she died scarcely 2 weeks later. But let me now offer you a handful of vignettes from my memoir, Walking with Evaristo, which together will hopefully give you a somewhat more fine-grained depiction of Guatemala's troubles near the close of the last century. Make no mistake, though, despite the fact that the Civil War ended in 1996, many of these troubles persist even today, and there's still much work to be done to bring justice, equality, and the rule of law to this land of the eternal spring. Another passage from my memoir. Rosendo Chalop was a respected citizen of Rabinal. Among other things, he was the president of the local ceramics cooperative, and by all accounts, he performed the duties of his office with dedication and zeal. Rosendo was also a comisionado militar, a civilian who was responsible for coordinating with the local military officials to round up young new recruits every once in a while. This state of affairs was customary in every community all across Guatemala. And to be fair, it was not unlike other countries where the finest upstanding pillars of the community are chosen to form a committee to send their young men off to fight in some remote swamp, desert, or jungle. The only difference being that in Guatemala there was no committee as such, and the war was not abroad, but at home. In fact, the war was being waged in the very community where one lived. Hence, the army always made sure that the raw recruits, in essence draftees, would unfailingly be posted to other communities far from their home of record. It's always easier to perform your assigned duty as a soldier so long as you're not looking into the face of your brother or sister, your father or your mother. But it was in his capacity as cooperativista, not as comisionado, that I got to know Rosendo over the course of the year. One day, early in the year, Rosendo stopped by my house with a special request. He wanted some guidance on how to develop some good marketing tools, like pamphlets and catalogs and such, to showcase the whole wide variety of ceramic pieces that were being produced every day by his fellow cooperativistas. We spent some time together that evening, and we met again at least one more time later on. And in these meetings, we discussed at some length how to put together some marketing paraphernalia that might be useful. Though I had no experience in marketing per se, I liked the idea of helping out with this project, and I had a veritable flood of seat-of-the-pants ideas that I hoped might set him off in the right direction. I saw Rosendo again on the Day of the Dead, a solemn day of remembrance and alcohol-fortified celebration in local cemeteries all across the country. Everyone in town congregates in and around the cemetery on the Day of the Dead. There's marimba music and copal incense. How I remember the sweet fragrance of copal. And the people all bring gifts of flowers and atol de plátano, cigars and aguardiente, photographs and knickknacks, transistor radios broadcasting norteñas at full volume, and any other favorite item that was loved or simply enjoyed by their loved ones while they were among the living. All these things are carefully arranged on the graves of the antepasados who exist now in another world. At this point in time, I was nearing the end of my second year in the Rabinal. My Spanish was pretty good, though I still knew only a smattering of words in the local language, achi. I bought myself an octavo bottle of Venado Especial. That's the portable version of a very cheap, powerful rum, and slipped it into my back pocket. I walked down the road from my house, past the church and the central plaza, passing by the Restaurante Las Diamelas, where I often ate dinner, and down past the military destacamento to the Calvario Chapel and the cemetery to be with my friends and neighbors for this mystical celebration amidst the colorful tombs and the sad earthen mounds. Viewing the cemetery festivities from afar, for I was still an outsider to this deeply personal mystery, I happened to run into Rosendo Cholop, and I sat down on a rustic wooden bench with him. We sat and talked for a while. Rosendo was pretty drunk, and I was already well past a good buzz myself. We talked very guardedly about the difficult times the town was going through. The army was everywhere, and people were disappearing. Rosendo wept, as drunken men sometimes do, and then, to my surprise, he became all of a sudden more lucid, and he begged me to help him get to the United States. Rosendo was the comisionado militar in town, the draft commissioner who singled out young men to go into the army. And yet now he was afraid of what the army might do with him. The army lieutenant had recently ordered that young men be rounded up in the nearby aldea of Pachalum. But this was a hamlet where Rosendo had friends and family. Therefore, he had resisted, or maybe simply slow-walked the order, questioning why. Rosendo begged me over and over again to try and help him get to the United States so he could be far from the danger that haunted him. Awkwardly and rather stupidly, I tried to allay Rosendo's mortal fears. Half drunk myself, I naively insisted that it can't be all that bad, and surely he'd find a way out of this. Of course, I knew that none of this was true, or even the least bit helpful. But I was half drunk and too inept, too much of a coward, really, to do what I should have done, or at least tried to do. The moment passed, and I remember little else from this Day of the Dead in the year 1980, but I do remember this much, which I've told you. For this, at least, is the part I can never forget. And there's another reading a little later in the book. It was now Semana Santa, 1981, Holy Week. By now there was so much that had already happened in the Rabinal. Nobody, though, had any idea what was still to come. I was hearing almost daily stories and rumors about what was going down in the aldeas. Clearly, lives were being lost, yet I was somehow shielded from ever seeing a single body. That lack of direct evidence, however, did not mitigate or deny the facts that were obvious to everyone in the Rabinal. There was an unspoken curfew in town now, and nobody ventured into the streets after about 7 p.m. I used to enjoy attending a boda reception at the invitation of a friend, but now such joy and frivolity lasting into the wee hours of the morning were no longer to be. People were still getting married, but they celebrated in the morning, in the early afternoon. I sat in the gray cinder-block comedor on the Rabinal's main drag near the church, eating my lunch of chuleta marañón with a Coke. The commanding officer from the Destacamento Militar was dining at another table just a few feet away from me, with two of his grunts sitting there at either side. One of them had set his assault rifle right on the dining table beside his plate. While we were eating, a solemn religious procession passed by outside on its way to the church. The slow, steady drumbeat of the cofradia as it passed by called us all to attention. We all got up and walked to the doorway to watch, including Doña Anita and her husband, who had been cooking in the back kitchen. It was Maundy Thursday, and this was the kind of solemn religious procession that you see in every Guatemalan pueblo on the red-letter days of the Catholic calendar. The procession walked slowly by while we were out on the sidewalk in front of the comedor, and it was not quite gone when the officer, in his crisp khakis, turned around and faced the rest of us, yanked out a silver crucifix hanging from his neck, grasped it tightly and ostentatiously like a talisman, and then announced in a firm, resolute voice to the rest of us on the sidewalk, "Yo soy católico también." That's it, my friend. That's all there is to say. The procession continued down the street. We all went back in and finished our lunch, and after that, each of us went back to his daily business. The next day, Good Friday, I was walking across the plaza by the church when I ran into the Rosendo Shalop, the man whom I'd commiserated with on a bench by the Calvario on the Day of the Dead several months before. Rosendo was holding with both hands a pretty little bunch of flowers. For his wife, he said. As I found out later from someone else, the two had had some sort of disagreement. Maybe a fight, perhaps over some a real or perceived infidelity. I'll never know the details, nor does it matter. What mattered was that Rosendo was walking across the plaza, carrying a bunch of flowers home to his wife to try to make things right. That evening, I was sitting in my hammock reading when I heard another one of those sporadic gunshots. This had been happening a little more frequently lately. While it was certainly unnerving, though, I still felt safe because, after all, I was the gringo in town, loosely connected to the U.S. Embassy, as I'm sure the commanding officer in town was well aware. I thought I enjoyed some measure of protected status in town, whether real or imagined. I momentarily raised my head, wondering what might have happened out there in the night, but then I simply returned to my reading. The darkness grew deep, and I listened to VOA for half an hour on the shortwave radio, smoking a cigarette in the dark before finally going to bed. I think I slept very well that night. The next day, a friend came up to me and told me that the night before, near the Molino, scarcely 3 blocks from the 3-room house I was renting, an army lieutenant walked into a little tienda right behind Rosendo Shalop, who was standing at the counter, and called out his name. Rosendo turned around, and the lieutenant calmly put a bullet in his forehead. I still remember Rosendo walking across the central plaza of Rabinal the day before, grasping a small bunch of flowers in front of him. And of course, I will always remember the Day of the Dead. I still to this day think about Rosendo often. He returns to me in my dreams, and I tell him I am sorry. I wish I'd helped him. He doesn't answer. And unlike Rosendo, I must live with that. So I have another passage I would like to share with you a little later on. One afternoon, a few weeks after Don Tomas's unsettling account of his brush with death at the hands of the army, this is related earlier in the book, I witnessed a strange phenomenon up in the sky that haunted me and made me wonder whether it was possible that spirits of some kind might actually be governing the course of events in the Rabinal as they unfolded. I was standing outside my front gate, looking up at the clouds to try and see what kind of weather might be developing, when I spied a flock of maybe 24 dark-colored birds that were not traveling anywhere at all, but rather were circling in a tight vertical spiral, slowly rising in the air above me. They continued to circle above me in this tight spiral for longer than a minute, and the sight of them made me think about the events of recent days and the connection or portent that might be augured. What do the birds tell us? What omen or harbinger does their strange behavior represent? Is the bird's spiraling flight meant to punctuate the final end of strife and terror? Or is it a warning to be heeded concerning even worse things yet to come? Some say spiraling birds in flight signify imminent death. Others that they are escorting the recently deceased to the afterlife. Calchas, the ancient Greek seer, might have helped me here, or maybe one of his professional peers from among the ancient Hittites, the Romans, or even the Mayans themselves. Calchas, the clearest by far of all the seers who scanned the flight of birds, he knew all things that are past, and all that are to come. The seer who had led the Argive ships to Troy with the second sight that god Apollo gave him. From Homer's Iliad. Calchas himself watched the birds and uttered his prophecies, and in many other cultures, individuals endowed with this same gift have always watched the birds closely, finding in their dalliances, their soaring flight, and their occasional aerial combat prophecies for human conduct and the community's destiny. Ornithomancy. I do not doubt that there could be something to it. And yet, on the other hand, the spiraling flock that I saw above me that afternoon might have had a much more straightforward explanation from the perspective of natural history. The birds I saw winding upward in their tight spiral could have been simply taking advantage of a buoyant thermal in the air, as birds sometimes do. Or they might have all been engaged in a coordinated effort to confuse a nearby predator. Second sight or sober science? In that moment, standing outside my gate, I felt not at all sure that one path of knowing was more certain than the other. Are birds really messengers from the gods, or are they just reptiles with feathers? A couple weeks later, I witnessed another uncommon sight in the sky, only this time it was in the morning, and the phenomenon I saw was of a decidedly more prosaic nature. I was walking down the street where I lived, headed towards the tree nursery, when I heard the distant buzz of an airplane engine. A small white single-engine plane, a Cessna perhaps, or some such craft, came flying over the mountains north of town and flew right over Cerro Cachup, that crumbling citadel of ancient warriors and spirits eternal. And then, as it flew over the pueblo, all of a sudden I saw falling from the plane thousands of tiny pieces of paper, first one cloud of them and then another. The plane flew off to the south and disappeared over the Sierra Chuacus as the two clouds of papelitos fluttered in the breeze and came slowly drifting to the ground, scattering everywhere. Many of the yellow papelitos, none bigger than a standard index card, landed almost at my feet, and I stooped to pick one up. I regret that I never saved one of these yellow slips of paper that fell from the sky. I do wish I had done so. But my best recollection is that each one conveyed a message of reassurance mixed with admonition. Reassuring everybody that the army was there to protect us all from the evil of armed rebellion, the curse of communism, while at the same time warning us all regarding the consequences of unpatriotic thought or action. It's been a very long time since I held that papelito in my hand, but I nevertheless recall that there was also a crude and unflattering little caricature of the rebel forces next to the words of admonition. The plane that had flown overhead looked for all the world like a private plane, but of course it might just as well have belonged to Guatemala's armed forces. I'll never really know. What was salient and certain about this occurrence, however, was what it signified. Rabinal was now most definitely on the radar as a new flashpoint in the war for Guatemala's soul. And in all likelihood, La Situación would only grow worse for us all in the coming months. Today it was a battle for hearts and minds waged with papelitos. Soon it would be a different kind of battle waged with weapons of a graver caliber. There was reason to believe, in fact, that the real battle had already begun. After that day, when I saw the strange sight of birds spiraling high above my house, I lasted about another year in the Rabinal. I was evacuated by the Peace Corps on November 7th, 1981, just a few weeks after a bloody massacre in the Rabinal Central Plaza, where the army murdered more than 200 innocent campesinos. Years later, back in upstate New York, I still felt tormented by the tragedy I had witnessed in the Rabinal. Here is one final passage from my memoir, Walking with Evaristo. Oh, Zeus, what can I say? That you look on us and care? Or do we, holding that the gods exist, deceive ourselves with insubstantial dreams and lies, while random, careless chance and change alone control the world? From Euripides, the tragedy Hecuba. Though I still maintained a belief in God, I had begun to adopt a more humanistic view of things. God the Creator? Yes, perhaps. I could definitely see Genesis as a plausible metaphor, not inconsistent with the Big Bang and evolution. But God the Fixer? Not bloody likely as far as I could see. So much remains broken. Verses like these stuck with me for a while, but I was still wandering alone through the fields of the ancient tragedies, and I was a bit lost. Reading one after another of those great stories, still looking for answers. It was not until later, in Aeschylus, where I finally found something like the answer that I was seeking. Words from the drama Agamemnon. We must suffer into truth, and even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. Whether we read it straight off of Aeschylus' script or recast it in the light of Christian teaching, I think I can now understand how the awful grace of God might somehow prepare us for future enlightenment. It's not an easy lesson to internalize, but it's an important one. The lesson from Aeschylus that we must suffer into truth was the first important piece of wisdom that crystallized my understanding of everything that had happened in the Rabinal. It was still an enigma, no doubt about it, but somehow it was now an approachable enigma, if that makes any sense. We ultimately have to face the reality of persistent evil in the world. And in Guatemala, during the time that I lived there, there was no shortage of evil to contend with, from the scorched earth terror campaign of General Benedicto Lucas to the man who stopped me on the street on Independence Day and said to me, "Estos indios, hay que matarlos todos." So I kept on searching for guidance from whatever source. My search brought me eventually to the Upanishads. In order to conquer evil, the spiritual teacher Eknatheswaran tells us in his meditations on the Upanishads that we must, quote, act without attachment to the results. The victory of good over evil is guaranteed, but not by the doer. We cannot win that victory, but we can make ourselves instruments of it, precisely by not thinking of ourselves as the doers, but by making ourselves zero, in Gandhi's phrase. End quote. Victory is guaranteed, but not by the doer. Okay, so we're faced with yet another enigma here. But what's that thing he said at the end of the quote? Making ourselves zero. I see now. So it all comes back then to Gandhi, to the Upanishads. Mohandas K. Gandhi, the man who was my adolescent hero so long ago in a world that, like today, was swirling with violence and injustice. Our purpose then is to do what is necessary to fight evil and to simply respond to evil with good, not with apathy or paralysis. Suffer into truth, make oneself zero, respond to evil with good. Or, as the poet Lao Tzu put it, use up all you are, and then you can be made new. Learn to have nothing, and then you will have everything. If you can put yourself aside, then you can do things for the whole world. And if you love the world like this, then you are ready to serve it. Words, words, words. Enough, I say, damn them all. In the end, I really just want to sit on the ground one night atop Cerro Cachup, high above Rabinal, right there beside the sacrificial altar, and peer deeply into the bright starry heavens and proclaim, along with Miguel de Unamuno, and to no one in particular, that, quote, uncertainty, doubt, perpetual wrestling with the mystery of our final destiny, mental despair, and the lack of any solid and stable dogmatic foundation may be the basis of an ethic. For that, I think, is in the final analysis probably the best we can hope for. Wrestle with the mystery, suffer into truth.
Maloko loko Pascos yor walokotis vanyas malcansar ko alola Pascos yor Pascos tem loko miércoles santos uros laqani Pascos tem ekur Pascos yor walokoti que peguri Dios khati que peguri Dios khamamri Dios tuchi dati hoş marinos parin maka qayat ko ko krasik que gasik ko que gasik ko que Pero chupan ko de kanila su ko de kanila kian ko ya kian cansar. Lo cuchillos a mi coche, lo cuchillos a coche, chillos a no ser, a hacer. Rico ko wala ki coche ko de kilo así ko ka pisa pisa. Ala ko yo sa pisa ko yo sa ma ala ko yo sa ma sa hala ko sa hala ko ma sa hala ko sa hala ko ko ya kasi malo ko ya pas ko ko bisa ko de kan ko bisa ko de kan wala ani mo ki kasi ala ko yo yani mas jadi yo yani santas ko to naman na siya ulit naman siya kalit naman siya ilang naman siya silong sigwat ko te de kama humay kamay usmay yani mas ko yani mas sa te de kama يعني مسكوري قطيح قناة يتوش قناة الغاوج ريشكي بيشكي مشكي موكي ولا قطيح سامي سوق سامي داخل كل لك كوتش كل